The Whisky A Go-Go was not a large room. It held perhaps 500 people at capacity, which on a good night it sometimes approached, and which on the night of October 1966 it had reached, not because the doors were famous, because they were not yet famous, but because the residency had been building, week by week, the particular kind of audience that forms around something that people cannot entirely explain to their friends but feel compelled to return to. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled beer and the particular electricity that collects in spaces where something genuine is consistently happening. It was, by any measure, a good place to be building a career. By 10 o'clock, everything was going as it usually went. The band had played through the first set with the focused intensity that had become their signature, Ray Manzarek's organ. Filling the room from the bottom up, Robbie Krieger's guitar finding the spaces between the chords, John Densmore driving everything from the back with a precision that made the complexity feel inevitable. And Jim Morrison at the microphone, doing what Jim Morrison did at microphones in the fall of 1966, delivering the poems in the voice that had found itself only a year earlier on a Venice Beach pier, the voice that still surprised him sometimes with what it could do and where it was willing to go. The set had been moving toward the end. This was not unusual. The End was the song they closed with, had been closing with for months, the song that had grown from a simple breakup song into something else entirely over the course of the residency's performances, accumulating layers and length and darkness with each iteration, as if the song itself were still in the process of understanding what it wanted to be. Each night it was slightly different. Each night it pressed slightly further into whatever territory it was trying to reach. The people who came regularly knew this about it, knew that the version tonight would not be the version from last week, that the song was alive in a way that composed songs usually were not, that what Jim Morrison did with The End on any given night was not a performance but an excavation. What happened on that particular night in October 1966 was not planned. This is the fact that matters most and that is easiest to misunderstand in retrospect, when the mythology has made everything about Jim Morrison seem predetermined, as if the Lizard King persona had always existed, as if the provocations were always calculated, as if the darkness in the performances was always controlled and intentional. What happened was not controlled. It was not intentional in any simple sense. It was the result of a person pressing as hard as he knew how to press against the form and finding, for reasons he could not entirely account for, that the form gave way. The song had been going for perhaps 15 minutes when it happened. Jim Morrison had been moving through the familiar landscape of the lyrics, the long hypnotic middle sections, the imagery of the road and the snake and the lake, the particular quality of his voice in that song which was different from his voice in any other song, lower and more interior and stranger, as if he were speaking from a place that the other songs did not reach. The band was with him, following the song's extensions with the practiced ease of musicians who had made this journey many times before and knew to trust wherever. The lead vocalist's instincts were taking them, and then Jim Morrison went somewhere none of them had been. The words that came out were not the words of the song. They were not words that had been written or rehearsed or previously performed in any version of The End that anyone in the room had heard. They came from somewhere that Jim could not afterward fully account for, from the place that the best material always came from, the place he had told John Densmore about when John had asked about the vocal takes that seemed to arrive from outside rather than inside. The good ones always feel like they came from somewhere else. These words came from somewhere else. They were Oedipal, violent in their imagery, pressing against the most fundamental taboos of Western consciousness, with the directness of someone who has walked past the warning signs and kept going. Because the signs were not his, the room went very quiet. This is what everyone who was there remembered first, not shock, not outrage, but a particular quality of silence that descended on the Whisky A Go-Go in the moment the words were spoken. The silence of 500 people who have heard something they were not prepared to hear and are now in the process of locating their response. Some of them would locate it as offense, some would locate it as revelation. Some would not be able to locate it at all and would spend years trying. Elmer Valentine, who owned the Whisky A Go-Go, was in the room. He had been watching the residency with the particular attention of a club owner who has something exceptional on his hands and is trying to understand exactly what it is and whether it is exceptional in a way that is good for business. He had been for most of the residency cautiously pleased. The doors were not easy, Jim Morrison was not easy, the performances were not predictable, and unpredictability in a club environment could go in directions that a liquor license could not survive. But the audiences were growing and the nights were generating something that he recognized from 30 years in the music business as genuine. He had been willing to accommodate the difficulty because of the genuineness. What he heard on that October night crossed the line that his willingness to accommodate had been drawn along, not because he was unsympathetic to artistic ambition, or because he did not understand that what Jim Morrison was doing was, in some sense, serious and intentional, but because a club on Sunset Strip had a specific relationship with its liquor license and its landlord and its place in the community. And what had just been said into a microphone in that room was not compatible with the maintenance of those relationships. Elmer Valentine made his decision quickly, as people who have been in the business for 30 years make decisions without extended deliberation, because extended deliberation was a luxury that situations like this one did not offer. He told his manager to inform the band that the residency was over. Tonight was their last night. The band received the news backstage after the set ended. The reactions were distributed along the lines of temperament that had always distinguished them from each other. Ray Manzarek was furious, not at Jim, or not only at Jim, but at the situation, at the fact that something extraordinary had just happened, and the immediate consequence was being ejected from the room where it had happened. John Densmore was quieter, carrying the particular concern that was his consistent mode when Jim pressed past the edges of what the world was prepared to accept. Robbie Krieger absorbed the information with the equanimity of someone who had learned, in his months with the band, to hold the unpredictable without being undone by it. Jim Morrison sat in the corner of the backstage area and said very little. He was not defensive. He was not triumphant. He was in the state that followed the performances that came from the other place, slightly dazed, slightly removed, in the process of returning to the ordinary dimensions of himself from wherever the song had taken him. Bill Siddons, who had been managing the band for only a few months, stood near the door and tried to calculate what this meant for the schedule and the relationships and the momentum that the residency had been building. What none of them knew yet, what would only become clear in the days that followed, was that someone else had been in the room that night. Jac Holzman, the founder of Elektra Records, had come to the Whisky a Go-Go to see the band he had recently signed. He had been in the room for the full performance, including the final minutes of the end. He had heard everything, and what he heard had not moved him in the direction of Elmer Valentine's response. It had moved him in the opposite direction entirely. Jac Holzman was, by the standards of the American music industry in 1966, an unusual figure, an intellectual who had built a label around the idea that music could be both commercially viable and genuinely serious, that the audience for real artistic ambition was larger than the industry believed, that the risk of signing artists who pressed against the edges of what was acceptable was a risk worth taking because the edges were where the most important things were happening. He had signed Tim Buckley. He had signed Love. He had signed The Doors. And what he had just witnessed in the Whisky a Go-Go, the room going quiet, the 500 people held in the silence of something they had not been prepared for, confirmed for him everything he had believed about why he had signed them. He found Jim Morrison outside, in the alley behind the club, after the backstage conversation had run its course. Jim was leaning against the wall in the way he leaned against walls when he needed to be outside the room, not dramatically, not performing solitude, just standing in the cool air of a Los Angeles October night and being somewhere that was not inside. Jac stood beside him and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That was the most important thing I've seen on a stage in years." Jim Morrison looked at him. The look that Jac would remember for the rest of his life, not gratitude, not relief, not the performed humility of someone receiving a compliment they were hoping for, something more complicated and more honest than any of those. He said, "We just got fired." Jac said, "I know." And then he said, "The album is going to be extraordinary." Jim was quiet for a long moment. The alley around them was dark and smelled of Los Angeles at night, exhaust and jasmine and the faint residue of the club's noise leaking through the back wall. Then he said, "The song needed to go there. It had been needing to go there for months. I couldn't keep stopping it." Jac Holzman understood this. It was, he would say later, the most important thing Jim Morrison ever said to him, not because of its content, which was straightforward enough, but because of what it revealed about the relationship between Jim and the material. The song had needed to go there. Not Jim had decided to take it there. Not Jim had wanted to see what would happen if he went there. The song had needed to go. The distinction was the difference between provocation and necessity, between performance and truth. And Jac Holzman, who had built a career on the ability to distinguish between those things, understood immediately which one he was dealing with. The first Doors album was recorded in August and September of 1966 and released in January of 1967. The End was on it, the full version, 11 minutes and 43 seconds, pressing into the same territory that the Whisky A Go-Go performance had pressed into, saying the same things that had emptied the room of its ordinary noise and replaced it with the silence of 500 people locating their response. The album reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. Light My Fire went to number 1 as a single. Jim Morrison became famous in the specific way that very few people become famous, his image detaching from his person and beginning its long independent life through the culture. The Whisky A Go-Go never rehired them. They did not need to be rehired. What the firing had produced, the conversation in the alley, Jac Holzman's certainty, the decision to put the End on the album without softening it, was more than the residency could have produced if it had continued indefinitely. The loss of the room had been the condition for the finding of everything else. Jim Morrison understood this, in the oblique and uncanny way he understood things that had not yet fully happened. In the alley behind the Whisky, leaning against the wall of a club that had just ended his employment, he had said, the song needed to go there, and it had. And the place it had gone was the beginning of everything that followed, the album, the fame, the image, the performances that would define a generation's experience of what rock music could be when it stopped being entertainment and became something more like necessity. The Whisky A Go-Go still stands on Sunset Boulevard. The room is smaller than it looks in photographs and louder than you expect, and it smells the same way it has always smelled, cigarettes and beer, and the electricity of 500 people who have come because something genuine is happening and they want to be in the room where it happens. On a wall near the entrance, a photograph of the Doors. During the 1966 residency, Jim Morrison at the microphone, his eyes closed, his mouth open, in the middle of something that the camera has caught but cannot contain. The song has needed to go there, and he is going. What the people who were in the Whisky A Go-Go that night remembered when they talked about it in later years, and many of them did talk about it, because it was the kind of night that becomes a story you carry with you, a thing that happened to you that you understand was significant before you understand why, was not the specific content of what Jim Morrison said. Memory is not a transcript. What they remembered was the quality of the silence that followed it, and the quality of Jim Morrison's voice in the moment before the silence, and the feeling that had descended on the room during those minutes, a feeling that several of them independently described using the same word, necessary. What had just happened had felt necessary, not comfortable, not welcome, not something any of them would necessarily have chosen to hear, but necessary, in the way that things are necessary when they say something true that the available forms have not previously been willing to say. This was the thing that Jac Holzman understood standing in the alley, and that Elmer Valentine understood in a different way standing at the bar, and that Ray Manzarek understood furiously, and John Densmore understood worriedly, and Robbie Krieger understood quietly, and that Jim Morrison understood in the oblique, precognitive way that he understood the things that mattered most to him. The necessity was the point. The song had been building toward that necessity for months, pressing in rehearsals and in the earlier performances, against the edge of what the form permitted, and on that particular October night the pressure had exceeded the form's capacity to contain it, and the necessary thing had happened. Ray Manzarek, in the interviews he gave over the following decades, returned to the Whisky firing more often than he returned to almost any other event in the band's history. Not because it was the most dramatic thing that had happened to them, it was not, but because it was the clearest illustration of the principle that had governed Jim Morrison's relationship to the material from the very beginning, that the work required whatever it required, and that the requirement was not negotiable, and that the consequences of meeting the requirement were not, in Jim's calculus, a reason to stop meeting it. The consequences were the price of the necessity. You paid the price. You followed the necessity, and whatever came next was what came next. What came next, in this case, was the album, and the album was extraordinary.